Good evening. We have with us in the studio Mr. Al Santoli. And Al, it's so nice to have you back here in Hawaii once again.
Thanks, David.
And for those of you in the audience who don't know, Mr. Santoli is really a living national treasure on mediating in zones of terror. And we're going to be talking a lot about the development of the humanitarian aspects of mediating in zones of terror and what it really means. And to kind of put this conversation in context, Al is about to receive an award from the President Aquino in the Philippines. It's, as I understand, it's going to be called an order of something for for his humanitarian work and the work of his famous NGO Asia America Initiative. I should know that name by heart by now, but I don't. And so, Al, let's talk a little bit about this award that you're about ready to receive. And for you listeners or the viewers, what we want to do is kind of show you the recognition that this man is going to receive for his achievements, and then kind of begin to wind the DVD or the tape backwards and look at the various building blocks that allowed him to get to where he is. So in that way, we hope that you'll be able to really kind of look inside of Mr. Santoli's heart and really see and understand more about what it takes and the building blocks so that you can successfully mediate in zones of violence or terror. But let's start with this Philippine presidential order that's coming up for you, Al. Let's talk about the current one, and we'll talk about one in the past in a moment. But what is this current award for, is your understanding?
My understanding is it's for the totality of work we've done over the past 10 years since 2002 in some of the most impoverished and violent areas of Southeast Asia, where there has been ongoing incidences of terrorism, where poverty is very extreme, and coincidentally, right now, where China is pushing in with their navy off the coast because of oil and gas. That adds to the complexity of the area, but first and foremost, any national security, as we've always stated in our mission statement, is based on respect for human dignity. And if we draw a lesson from history, during World War II, after the Philippines and the rest of Southeast Asia fell to the Japanese, the guerrilla warfare that was conducted was based on mutual trust between the local, largely tribal peoples and stay behind or trapped Western, whether it be British or American forces, who remained in those places because there was no way out. And in fact, the area where we have our major programs, there's a place called Quezon Beach, which is a white sandy beach at the very southern tip of the Philippines, looking out into the water toward Australia. Okay. And that happens to be where Douglas MacArthur escaped after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor and Manila, most importantly, and headed for the safety of Australia in order to plan his return. And even today, some of the older tribal people there, who happen to be about 99% Muslim, tell me this is where MacArthur caught the boat, and your father and my father were together, even though there have been periods that have been very difficult between the local Muslim tribes and the central government in Manila. There's never been this sense of, you represent a part of the United States and a part of being an American that we can relate to, because we were together before. You came in here when no one else had believed in us.
Sure.
And the whole idea, my strategy at that time, which was supported by Colin Powell and Rich Armitage, who were the directors Secretary and Deputy Secretary at State Department, even though we've always been a private organization with no connection to U.S. government in terms of official status, that the role that what Asia America Initiative has been doing has been citizen diplomacy, not soft power. To me, I don't understand this soft power.
Citizen diplomacy.
It's citizen diplomacy.
All right, and for our viewers, what you should understand is the area of focus right now for Asia America Initiative, and this is the reason that the President of Philippines is going to be awarding the Order of the whatever it is to Mr. Santoli and his organization, is the area of operations really is in the heavily Muslim areas in the southern Philippines,
Yes.
Mindanao, Zamboanga,
Yes.
and to the south.
Yes, and also up in the areas which are some of the best these days with climate change, the best food growing areas that we're working on a lot of agricultural programs. We just brought in a huge 40-foot container full of vegetable and fruit seeds to be able to do what we call Gardens of Peace, which is community-based and school-based gardens so that people could have basic sustenance.
And where are those Gardens of Peace located?
They're up in the northern part of Mindanao, in areas, for anybody that knows the Philippines, like Lanao del Sur, Lanao del Norte, Iligan, and then also Cotabato, and then we're also doing some to the south as well. But interesting thing is the urban gardens we're doing in Manila through a process called aquaponics, which is a combination of little fish farms
Okay.
and
okay.
also using compost made from organic garbage to be able to do, where there's not much topsoil, very productive, very fertile, quarter acre, half acre, full acre of very productive gardens right in the middle of the city.
Metro Manila area.
Right in the middle of the city, which can be used in Los Angeles, in New York, in
Interesting.
Washington, Detroit, Cleveland. That's my idea, is to be able to transpose some of what we're doing with the urban gardens into some of the hard-hit, economically depressed areas here in the United States.
Well, with that as an introduction, where you have a little bit of a peek into the kind of the heart of a humanitarian, where of course we're talking about the big picture here is we're going to be talking about mediating in zones of terror, and you have a picture a little bit about what Asia America Initiative is up to in the principally, not exclusively, but in the southern islands of the Philippines. What is was there a prior presidential citation or award coming
Yeah.
out of the Philippines for you?
Yeah.
This was
In
what year?
2003.
And what was that for?
That was because we went into this area where, at the time, the only outsiders in this one place, the island of Holo, were Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law and myself. And he was trying to gin up terrorism because bin Laden had married a local girl in order to recruit. And I worked with the local religious leaders, principally Muslims, in terms of what was needed for the community, which was better education opportunities, and also help re-establish a hospital for 500,000 people. And we also worked on other reaching out to non-extremist groups who were fighting for dignity, and with the full support of the Philippine President and Secretary of Defense. We've never done anything that was outside of the parameters of what would be national policy. And we were able to help turn that situation around. Bin Laden's brother-in-law had to leave. When I had death threats against me by some of the guys that he was associating with, the other guerrillas went to them, went to their families, and reminded them that I was their guest and that there would be retaliation. So, I mean, yeah, I don't carry a weapon, but it's a violent place, and you have to be accepted and respected by the community or you can't survive. I've never had a problem with anyone saying what we were doing was wrong from within the government or the local military, because we're always very transparent.
And in fact, they are very supportive and love the work that you're doing.
Yeah, we've always done this with a memorandum of agreement with the Philippine Presidential Office, the Foreign Ministry, as well as with the successive Secretaries of Defense and Chiefs of Staff of the Armed Forces. So it's always been very, again, citizen diplomacy. And sometimes as an outsider, if you allow yourself to be open to understanding the history and local culture, there's more that you can do because nobody owes you blood, because you've never done anything to harm anyone, that they would say we have a feud with you. And at the same time, I try to look objectively at who people are. If someone tried to kidnap any member of my staff, they'd have me not being so soft and sweet. But at the same time, as long as there's a clear understanding that my staff and I are not to be abused by anyone except, people who are on the fringes or on the violent extreme, even then that's not allowed. But if the community can't protect you, then you shouldn't be there. That's one of my
Sure.
cardinal rules. Either if you're going to be accepted and protected, and if you're not, then you shouldn't be there. You're asking for trouble if that's the case.
The thrust of this program is going to be to show you the component pieces or the building blocks that allowed Mr. Santoli to evolve into a national living treasure on humanitarian assistance in zones of terror and how this works. And in order to do this, kind of to illustrate this point, before we go back into talking about the first building block for your career, Al, that these are like bricks that all fit together. I'm not going to ask you to do this physically, but intellectually, if you were to pull out your mobile phone now, do you have the ability to, with your mobile phone, talk to some of the Muslim leaders in the southern Philippines directly?
Yeah. Between myself and my staff, because we've worked with everyone not everyone, but many, for the past 10 years. The same way when I was working on Afghanistan, when I was in U.S. Congress as a national security advisor, we were keeping alive many communities before 9/11 who later became the resistance against the Taliban. But at the time, the U.S. government had completely abandoned them. If you saw the end of the movie, Charlie Wilson's War.
Right.
Starting in 96, when bin Laden went back to Afghanistan from Somalia, I started working it right after, because for those of us that knew Afghanistan, and we didn't trust Pakistan, and we didn't trust the Saudis, we knew that some bad things were happening, that were going to go beyond those mountains. And at the time, U.S. government policy was principally to look at this oil pipeline that would have gone from Turkmenistan to Caspian Sea and Turkmenistan, which is like above Iran and kind of adjacent to Afghanistan, to go on a diagonal down to Karachi in Pakistan. And what the Saudis and the Pak snookered our intelligence agency to believe was that the Taliban were going to protect this pipeline, which fat chance, because the Saudis didn't want it built. And they snookered everyone with that, plus got their boys protected. So there were a few of us barbarians in Congress who stayed within U.S. law because we did not provide any legal...
Oh, wait, let's not give that away yet. We'll have our viewers wait until we get to there. Because
to get to the barbarian
to get
side
to the
of
barbarian side of it. You're watching Asia in Review, and the title of our program here is Mediating in Zones of Terror. And we're talking with Mr. Al Santoli, who is a national living treasure on the use of humanitarian, or the art of humanitarianism in zones of violence and terror. And Al, let's shift topics here just and talk about the first component piece or the first piece of the puzzle that goes down on the table. You know, ladies and gentlemen, this art that we're talking about being able to mediate in zones of terror, is somewhat like, you know, excuse me on this, Al, I'm going to take a kind of a different approach here. It is sort of like if you've ever put down tiles in a kitchen floor, and the most important one that you put down is probably the first one. And that's the one that typically you put that in the center, and then you build out from there, the experiences that you have. And so, Al, let's jump into the early years for a moment. And for you, at age 18, the first building block on this whole very unusual skill and perspective that you have today comes from your time in Vietnam. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing is that I wouldn't say, you know, use the term national living treasure per se, because there's a lot of very good people that are out there, and I don't think I'm better than anyone else. But the one thing that shaped me tremendously, having been wounded 3 times as a young soldier, even before I turned 19 years old, was a sense of humility and a sense of knowing that when you see in combat that some of the people you respect the most can be killed or seriously injured, and other people who have absolutely no skill, well, I'll be polite and use the word skill, or character, can survive without a scratch, you have to say, well, God has a plan and a destiny for everyone. So one has to be respectful of that, because no matter how good you are in terms of knowing your technique and doing your training, training helps. I mean, training, people say you fight as you train, and it's the same thing. You do your mediation as also you prepare. You have to know culture, history, the dynamics of what has caused the conflict to begin with, and the personalities involved. All of this takes time. It's not something, oh, you get a government contract and you go in, and that's the failure of Iraq and Afghanistan, is that there's been too much of this, 3 cups of tea, little tea bag, drink 3 cups of it. It doesn't work. And the thing that I found is that it takes a lot. I've been doing this 10 years in the Philippines with Afghanistan. It's been now going back to 96. That's how many years is that? And it's hard work. It's time consuming. It's a lot of personal sacrifice, because your family, and people in the military know this, and police officers and firemen, that your family suffers because you have to put a lot of time into it. And people might say, well, you're ignoring us, people close to you.
Right.
You don't care about. No, it's not that. The reason you do it is because you do care about them, and you want to see a better world for your kids and your neighbors' kids to grow up in, not having to take their shoes and their belts off every time they go into an airplane because they're afraid that someone has an underwear bomb or a shoe bomb. That's the thing that really struck me when I first started re-engaging in Afghanistan after bin Laden went back, was this demonic manipulation of these kids that were orphans, that were
All right,
being...
we'll save that. We're going to get to that.
Okay.
We're going to get to that.
But that was horrendous, and that shapes everything we do today.
This Vietnam experience that you had, what is the piece of that experience that is the building block for you in the type of work that you do as mediating in zones of terror? What is it that came out of the Vietnam War for you that was helpful?
I think the thing was that I went into it a very tough kid, in the infantry, young, 18. By the third time I was wounded, and I had to go to Japan and then come back to do, because I wanted to. I didn't want to leave my unit, and I still had time left, and I didn't want to be knocked out of the war on the Vietnamese communist terms. If I was going to leave, I wanted to do my time and come out of it. That was my mentality at the time.
Okay. That's
And
very
the
admirable.
tenacity, which is also in mediation. You have to be tenacious, even if you're being, quote, soft. there's still a tenacity that's involved that you don't get easily thrown off.
You have to
and
just stay engaged.
You have to stay engaged.
Right. Okay.
And when I went back, my closest friend, who also happened to be the head of the unit that I was in, the commander of the unit I was in the infantry, his name was Mike Andrews. Mike was put in charge of an experimental reconnaissance and intelligence unit to replace traditional special forces that had been pulled out of the area because of politics on the Cambodian border, not that far from Saigon. And because I couldn't go back to the infantry because of Three Purple Hearts, I went back out with Mike into a, quote, non-infantry unit.
So explain for those of us who don't know, what's the difference?
There wasn't much. Well, this was reconnaissance, but the significant thing about it was that we lived away from Americans, a small group of us, with the local people, because our job was finding the North Vietnamese armies, that they would come through Cambodia to prevent another Tet offensive. We were one of the reconnaissance units on the Cambodian border,
and what was
living with the local people.
Okay, and that living with the local people was one little, if you will, a gold nugget of knowledge that you have used since.
Yeah, because it taught me how to get out of my own cultural psychology. And it taught me, this was an area where I had fought in as an infantry soldier. Wow. And there was a lot of hard feelings. And it taught me not to hold grudges and not to be hateful and to find common bonds with people. And then, because it seems that often when you're doing an intervention in a country, in a culture that's not your own, you tend to be very kind of centralized on your own movie, your internal movie.
Okay.
And everybody else is like a backdrop. They're like extras in the movie. You know, it's like Braveheart, and you've got the masses, you know, with the paints and you know. And what this taught me is that I became part of the extras.
All right. Okay.
Right, and I got to learn to think the way the extras would think, and I lived in their communities, and I ate with them, and you know,
you got to walk in their shoes, sort of.
That made a big difference. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's opened me up to the process. The second thing that happened was that while that time I was in Japan, I just had blood poisoning in my back from one of the wounds that I had that got infected. I was on an orthopedic ward with a lot of people who had lost their legs, lost their arms, had big holes in various parts of them. And I was being trained to be a physical therapy assistant because there wasn't enough staff, and I was one of the people that was mobile because I had use of my arms and legs.
Okay.
And the head of the clinic, who was a registered therapist and a colonel, wanted me to stay because they were shorthanded, and you know, it was nice because I was myself an infantryman that I could relate with the guys, and they said, well, it's important for us because you understand, and you know, before they got their artificial arms and legs, it's a psychological as well as physical process.
Sure.
And I just had a natural aptitude for that, so she put in my records that I was trained as a physical therapist and a physical therapy assistant, not as a therapist, but as an assistant. And and I wound up getting college credits for that even, and that because when I started in college, I thought that was what I was going to do, but the bottom line was that opened me up to a healing mentality. So when I went back, and then this position opens up,
right,
boom, that stuff started to come together. Then when I got back to the U.S. and I wanted to get out of the Army to go to, I was only 19, I wanted to go out of the Army to go to college to study physical therapy. I wound up working at nights. Well, make a long story short, I did get it. Fort Gordon, Georgia was the orthopedic center for the Southeast, and that meant a lot of people coming back from Vietnam without arms and legs. And I worked in the clinic. They were shorthanded.
Okay.
And the same thing, it worked to my advantage that I was an infantryman because I could work with people in a way by which they could talk to me. And at night, we ran a program with a couple of the regular therapists. who were fully trained at a state hospital outside of the wire on the border of South Carolina and Georgia at a place called Gracewood State Hospital, where we worked with about 100 kids who had severe cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, and also they had also mental disabilities. So they had no spoken language.
Wow.
And these kids were up to the age of 12 or 14, and they couldn't speak. So I had to learn how to communicate without words. Physical touch, yes, is part of it, because you were teaching people
Right.
how to keep
Okay.
their heads straight, how to stand up. They're from very poor homes. Many of them lived in the countryside on the border of Georgia and South Carolina, which was a very poor area. And so I had to learn how to communicate without words. So I went from living with Vietnamese in areas that I didn't understand the culture or the language, to coming back, okay, during the day I'm working in the Army hospital, but at night I'm working with these kids who had no spoken language and severe disabilities. So I had to learn how to communicate without nonverbal communication. All of this tied in to when I'm working in other cultures today. And often the whole idea of touching somebody, I can be around very violent people and I'll wind up touching them. I mean, this is
Okay.
also a part of mediation, which is, because a lot of times people say, you're not afraid of us, you're not afraid of me. And I say, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe I am, maybe I'm not, but does that matter? I'm here.
Sure.
And but the bottom line is, what I learned, the skill of nonverbal communication transcends language. So when I'm working in other cultures where I don't have the language, there's other ways you're communicating. All of that plays into the art of mediation. We're talking about the art of mediation.
Yes.
This
Yep.
is all part of the art, because some of it is done in a way by which it's instinctive, and there's communication going on that builds trust, that goes, because anybody's going to say, yeah, and especially in Asia, because people are always like, okay, that's great, but like, what do you really mean? Nobody trusts your words. So the issue of how you convey what you mean is very important, because it's an instinctive kind of communication. And there's been times I've been in situations, even where I've had to protect soldiers, American soldiers, who were too proud to admit that they needed somebody to bail them out without blowing somebody's head off, that it's this kind of nonverbal communication and the
Okay.
ability to get along with people that makes all the difference in the world. Because you can kick down somebody's door, they're not going to be afraid of you, they're going to hate you. But if you can walk into the jungle, into the middle of a guerrilla camp, if they're not the crazies high on drugs that will cut off your head, because
Okay.
that happens too, and I
Okay.
won't do things crazy like that. But you can accomplish the whole lot without shooting anybody. It doesn't mean you have less concern, or that you have less of any skill that a soldier would use, except that you're manifest. It's like a great martial artist. Doesn't
Okay.
have to break somebody's arm. A great martial artist, by their presence, it's an instinctive that everybody around them knows this is a person.
Don't mess with this guy.
Don't mess or respect this person.
I got you. I got
That's
you.
why you see these 90-year-old Tai Chi masters just whipping people around the room that are like 20 years old and 3 times their size, because they know how to conduct themselves. And that's what we aim to do. This is like a martial art.
Well, this whole discussion that we've had the last few minutes, to me, Al, is very fascinating, because your experience in Vietnam, what I see coming out of this are 3 very critical building blocks, or gold nuggets, whatever you want to call them, for this whole concept of mediating in zones of terror. So one of them is the experience that you have living amongst the local people, learning the culture. And that's very, very significant, because that's what you are and what you do. The second piece that I've heard you talk about here is that you develop kind of the healer mentality in working in the ward in Japan and and then back in the United States, the development of the heart, if you will, to assist people, to make them try to feel better about themselves, or better about their physical capabilities, improving their physical capabilities. And then the third piece that you've talked about here, that the third gold nugget that came out of this brutal experience that you had in Vietnam was the concept of being able to communicate non-verbally. And you talked about the importance of touch as an example, and being who you say you are, and having credibility and people respect you, coming back to this martial arts example. So from those early years in Vietnam, there were three very important building blocks that I see coming out of this. Is that about right?
Yeah, there are probably more, but I think that when you talk about this particular experience of professionally what I'm doing now, it comes from those experiences. This is why, like you could say, in the old days, by the old days meaning before these 10 years of war on terror, when you talk about special operations, especially from the Army sense, most of the people would fail.
They would fail.
The qualifying course. Not because they weren't physical specimens, or they
Okay.
couldn't swim as far as you were supposed to swim, or they couldn't shoot straight, or this or that. It's because there's a certain psychology that people like General Yarborough and the others who created this knew that if you're working behind the lines, and that's what it was intended for.
Okay.
So for military people that were watching this, there is a synchronized element of it that interfaces between the military side and the civilian side. The big difference is this is not psychological operations. People have to trust that you're their friend, and that you'll die for them as much as they would die for you, or else they'll betray you because they feel you're going to betray them.
We're going to move on
Yeah.
to another section of this program. You're watching Asia in Review, and we're talking about mediating in zones of terror with Mr. Al Santoli. And we've just covered what I call the early years,
The formative
the
years.
formative years, as Al is a young man, and you can see the building blocks for his work in the very poor, heavily Muslim-held areas of the southern Philippines now, based on that. But let's dig in a little deeper here. From your time in Vietnam, Al, then the next area that I guess that our viewers ought to know about is that you come back to the United States after the Vietnam War, and you become a best-selling author.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what is that all about?
I've always been a writer, even when I was a kid. But what happened was in college, I had a very good English teacher during I got out of the Army, a little bit of an early out, semester early. And I had an English teacher in my first, actually one of my first 3 classes, who said, wow, she goes, I just feel somehow that there's a writer inside of you. Why don't you explore that? And at that time, given that this was like 1970, and most people that came out and went to college at that time, it was the height of the anti-war movement, you didn't go like advertising that you were a Vietnam veteran, because then you had to deal with all kinds of crap and all kinds of statements that you just didn't want to hear about.
Right.
So most people didn't even know that I had even been in the Army. And I devoted my time in school to developing as a writer. And even though I worked and did things like volunteering in free clinics and kept up medical type things, my real kind of inner strength was as a communicator. And I moved to New York in 1977 and got involved in a theater company that was made up of all Vietnam veterans, even the technicians. The The actresses in the company, of course, were not, and they were mostly doing like soap operas and commercials and small-time movie work. One of the actors in the company I see just has a new TV show, Dan Lauria. So plugging Dan's show, but Dan was one of our actors,
okay.
and he played the Vince Lombardi on the Broadway stage and whatnot. We were like a repertory company. But at the same time, I also started during that time working on an oral history because I wanted to show
Oral
people
history of the
Vietnam War.
Okay.
Because
What's oral history, by the way?
it's people telling their story and you shaping it into a collective monologue that it's the emotional history, or what academic historians would say is anecdotal.
Okay.
Because you're coming from the emotion of the experience as opposed to trying to tell a narrative academic history. And both have their place. They complement each
Right,
other.
right.
Studs Terkel was the master of oral history, and he came out of a theater background. His books were like Working, Hard Time, this and that. He was kind of one of my role models, and it was really exciting. After this book came out, the first one that came out, I was able to do his radio show in Chicago and got to meet him in person. It was really a lot of fun.
What are the books that you wrote? Let's just tick those off for the audience.
Everything We Had was the first one. Now,
Okay.
Everything We Had came out of that experience of being in the theater company. And if you know the play Our Town,
Right.
where it's
okay,
like a lot of,
okay.
that's what oral history is like. Everyone tells monologues, whether it's 1 page or whether it's 10 pages. It shapes the history of a town. It shapes the culture of a town. So you understand the town by the voices of the people who live there.
And so you were trying to
I
get
did
people
that for the Vietnam veterans experience.
Oh, okay.
This was at a time when Dirty Harry needed an excuse why somebody was a psycho killer. Oh, that person was a Marine in Vietnam. Or Kojak needed
Okay.
someone, then, oh yeah, that guy was Special Forces in Vietnam. Or they would always blame veterans for anything bad.
So you
And what I did, this was my strike against Hollywood, and the way that we had been so badly characterized, and I was fortunate that every publisher in New York rejected the initial. You have to do like 2 chapters, an introduction, and
Okay.
a table of content. It was rejected by every publisher in New York. The agent who was represented, Ruth Hagee Broad, was dying of cancer. She never saw the book come out, but it was her last project. I was like an unknown. I had no money, and it sounds familiar. And the way that I got the equipment to do the interviews is a friend of mine who was in the theater with me, who was a veteran, knew some people in Brooklyn who knew the horses.
okay.
And he was able to win money at the racetrack that we put into.
No kidding.
That's true.
No kidding.
We to buy the equipment that I used to do the interviews with, the tape recorder,
Right,
and nice
right.
microphones.
Okay.
But that was a product of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn.
All right.
And so anyway, it was the working with the veterans in the theater company, who were a very good, very talented group. A few of the people in the company were in the book, but I went all over the country. I wound up, there was a young editor at Random House named Grant Ujifusa, who later became more known for the Almanac of American Politics, which he was one of the creators and editors of, co-editor with Mike Barone for many years. But he believed in us. He came from Wyoming, and he had a friend that died in Vietnam, even though he was a Harvard boy. And he was also editor, I think he was a co-editor of the Harvard Crimson, so he had a little bit of the Ivy League stuff behind him. But he was also Japanese American.
Al, let me ask you.
So Grant was the one person that believed in us.
Let me ask you 2 questions here, because we want to cover so much ground in this
Yeah.
show.
I'm sure you'll edit that part of it out. It kind of went on a bit.
Let's just list off the books that you've written, and you
Okay.
were nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, right?
Everything We Had.
Everything We Had, What else?
To Bear Any Burden,
To Bear Any Burden.
which was because it was an American and Asian oral history looking at why Vietnam didn't succeed.
I like that book. I like that a lot. Okay, what was the next
The
one?
third one, this completed a trilogy, was Leading the Way,
Leading the Way.
which was done after the first Desert Storm in 1991, explaining how the military was rebuilt with good leadership by people who had served in Vietnam, stayed in the military, and overcame all of the challenges. Colin Powell, that's how I got to know Colin Powell. I interviewed Colin Powell for the book.
I see.
And a number of other very, very good people.
So after the
And then the fourth book was New Americans, which was the story of like the Cold War, of people who had come to the United States from all over the world legally to be able to, escape communism and find their
New Americans.
New Americans. So during the period between, I started doing this writing in '77, I was still in my mid-20s, until '90, but the last book came out, Leading the Way, in about '94, right before I started working in Congress. And so during that period of about 12 years, I was like, the center of my life was writing books, even though I was doing
you became
a
a best-selling author.
Yeah, that's true.
And
People forget that now. I forget it sometimes too.
And you wrote for did you write for the New York Times?
No, I wrote for Parade magazine.
Parade
I was a
magazine,
contributing editor at Parade, and actually, Parade has more readers than the New York Times.
Interesting.
And but most of Parade stories are like, what people eat, how much do people make, movie star profiles. But I didn't do that stuff. I was working on political issues, and for the work I'm doing now, community development. I did over in a period of 5 or 6 years more than 24 stories on people doing incredible community development work all over the United States, which was like getting a doctorate degree in community development.
Okay, so
And that formed also a basis for what I'm doing now as well, because I transposed what I saw in good leadership here at the bottom of the pyramid. People who lived in housing projects, school teachers, people working for community centers trying to get boys to be responsible for the children they bring into this world, people working with gangs in Los Angeles and in Miami. My gosh, a female truck driver. If I go through this, it's just incredible. And I learned so much about leadership, especially on a community citizen leadership, not citizen diplomacy, but people within their own communities taking responsibility for the well-being of their community. That will also lay the basis for this work I'm doing now.
Well, let's just kind of summarize where we're at here. After the Vietnam War, you begin this career as a best-selling author, and
I got bored with it.
I understand you got bored with that. I can see why, based on your background.
But I'd say bored, not being flippant, but I like working with people. As a writer, you spend a lot of time in your own head. If I
Okay.
wasn't doing oral history, which means engaging people and basically using the art of writing to help to tell a collective story of a period of history, it's very democratic in its approach.
So this episode of your life that leads you to Parade magazine, and it's I think our viewers can see the expertise that evolves out of this in community development areas, and what other so that's one nugget that comes out of this gold nugget that comes out of this period of time that assists you in what you do now. Is there another one that kind of the development of perspective or something like that?
Yeah, during that whole period, I was doing refugee relief work in Southeast Asia as well, and
We'll get to that in a moment, but that
was a very important part of it.
All right.
So, there was never a dull moment.
You're watching Asian Review, and we're talking about mediating in zones of terror with Mr. Al Santoli, and we're digging down into his heart a ways here and looking at some of the formative building blocks that contributed to his work as an artist in this field, because it is an art. And We've talked about his experience in the Vietnam War and his time as a best-selling author developing that skill. Let's follow into the area that you just mentioned, your refugee work now, and does that start in Cambodia?
Well, it started with when everything we had became
The book.
Yeah, that became prominent. There were people from Southeast Asia who were refugees in the U.S. who said, "Hey, I'm really happy to see this, but there was a reason that that war didn't turn out well, and I think it would be great if you could explore that because of the difference in cultural understanding, because they knew I had a feel for that because they had seen me doing interviews,
Okay.
and I was talking about that, and they said, well, why don't you just explore that?
Okay, what year is this that you start to go back to Southeast Asia then?
About 81, 82,
81, okay.
82, right after everything we had came out, and I was fascinated. It's like, yeah,
And what
that
did-
makes a lot of sense because you can't only the war involves multiple people. Somebody's just not there. Although it seems a lot of times the United States does that. We sit there and we punch ourselves. But in these cases of this war on terror today, but the Vietnam War, it's not just us punching ourselves. We're just not sometimes making the right decisions.
What-
But there's somebody else to step on our feet
what
and
is-
give us a kick in the butt when we do make mistakes.
What is the refugee work that you did do? Tell us about
At that time, it was multifold. On one hand, I was helping with refugee protection from an international law standpoint with the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights out of New York. Arthur Helton who died in Iraq, he was in the UN compound when it got blown up by the car bomb. Arthur was the head of the refugee law program, or the first asylum program. And I was also doing some work with International Rescue Committee, which was Leo Chern's group at the time. Bob DeVecchi was chairman. And in Cambodia, I learned about the genocide, and there were still 1 million refugees at that time on the Thai border.
A million refugees?
1 million, 1 million.
So this is
And the
immediately
Vietnam-
after the Khmer Rouge time frame?
Well, they were still around, and the Vietnamese were just as bad in some ways.
And what year is this?
Because they wanted to take all the rice fields in Cambodia. So this would be 82, 83. I did that from 82 through 1990. 8 years.
Working refugee
Going back
problem?
and forth,
Okay.
going back and forth. And
Did this include Laos as well?
included Laos, it included the whole area, rescuing boat people on little smugglers' boats, going out and finding. And again, this is where, people like Rich Armitage and others who had been, I think Colin Powell at the time was National Security Advisor for President Reagan. Rich, who's on my board now, was at Defense Department in a position that dealt with this stuff. So, that led to becoming Reagan's unofficial Team B. Was basically opening the door. At the time, we were losing to the Soviets. People forget that the Soviets almost won the Cold War. And
What is Reagan's Team B? Because maybe there are folks in our audience who don't understand what that is.
Reagan's Team B was to have the door open to experts from all over the United States who knew the countries where the biggest battles of the Cold War were being waged, whether it be the Middle East, Central America, like Nicaragua, El Salvador, Africa, Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. For me, it was Cambodia. For other people, it was Afghanistan was heavily prominent in that.
Okay.
And the door was just open, where we would talk to people within, all of us not wanting to be in government.
Well, you weren't in government at the time.
No, not at all.
Were you ever in the CIA?
Never.
Okay, and so
The difference between this work, and forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing anyone, but our role is beyond immediate policy, is to stay engaged. As a civilian, you're creating long-term relationships.
Okay.
And even when U.S. policy becomes
Shifts.
you're still there, because we look at things in a multi-generational approach.
Ladies and gentlemen, you got that? Because you're watching Asian Review. We're talking about mediating in zones of terror, and Mr. Santoli has just delivered, one of the largest gold nuggets of the evening here, and talking about the significant difference between a civilian NGO or civilian relationship and as opposed to one that's a governmental relationship that's lashed to policy.
It'll be affected by, and sometimes the policy, policy goes like this. It goes in and out. There needs to be consistency, especially because as we get older, we know that time goes very fast. And history continually repeats itself. So you need to have, I use an acronym for AAI, and that's called ACT, A-C-T. It's, accountability.
Okay.
Number one, you're accountable for your actions. 2 is consistency.
All right.
And 3 is transparency. So if you and I are doing this interview today and people, are listening and watching, if tomorrow I'm in a different part of the world, I'm not going to change what I say. It's very transparent.
It means that you walk the walk and talk the talk.
We try to.
Yeah.
We try to.
I got you. Okay. So in this period of time while you are associated with Reagan's Team B, that doesn't mean you're on the payroll of...
No, I never got paid a cent from government.
It's just the Team B concept was the door was open to expertise in those areas of conflict.
Yeah, and I think it's because people like Bill Casey, now getting back to the role, the positive role that the people in Langley had at that time. Casey came out of OSS. He then went to work in Wall Street, and a big part of the way that the Cold War ended with the Soviet Empire falling is because the guys from the economic side understood that the Russians' weakness was their economy and that they were overextending themselves militarily. So there had to be engagement with economic experts on that level
Okay.
to understand how do we do this without having a nuclear war, because the alternative was a nuclear war.
Right.
For people like myself that were working in the brutal hinterlands, and the people that were working in Angola, Mozambique, Nicaragua, El Salvador, etc., we were dealing with a different kettle of fish, which was very brutal. It was very immediate, where mass murder was taking place, and you had to figure out how do you sort this stuff, create stabilization, because at the time, and it's interesting because later in Central Asia, I talked to people that were trained KGB from the Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan and other places, who were trained by Primakov. Yevgeny Primakov was like the real master of Russian KGB, especially in Middle East. Their idea was you don't have to hold territory to be effective, you create chaos. If you create chaos, and later the Chinese said the same thing in 1997-98 when they published a doctrine book by the People's Liberation Army, and they said Osama bin Laden and people like him will be the hardest thing for a big technological military like the United States to deal with, because they are non-predictable, they are non-technological, and they operate in ways by which an overconfident country reliant on technology can't deal with. Bingo, bango, bongo. When bin Laden goes back, for those of us that knew the Primakov doctrine, which this is part of,
Sure.
because Primakov trained a lot of people. But also, if you read Three Kingdoms and other famous Chinese novels, which all their military and political officers read, because the Chinese are very proud of their thousands of years of history, and they've learned many profound lessons with the rise and fall of their own empires.
Right.
It's always, you have to use any means necessary to defeat a rival kingdom. Sometimes it's economics, it's always involving deception, sometimes it can be using small-scale, asymmetrical, sometimes it can involve a big army, but you use whatever is there to your advantage. And this is what got us so concerned about Afghanistan and what was happening there.
We'll move into Afghanistan in a moment here.
Okay, but this all ties in.
I understand.
And it's a matter, as a historian, of understanding the patterns of history and not taking any of that for granted. Because other people do take their own.
Right.
We, as Americans, we don't have much history. We have 200 years. It's
right.
nothing.
Before we get into the Afghanistan issue here, just very quickly, during the initial part of your work with as part of this Reagan Team B, the Cambodia experience that you have, I'll include Laos with that, is that fair?
It all was simultaneous.
All simultaneous.
The Vietnamese were controlling all those areas
And you-
with the support of the Russians as part of their global strategy.
And so in that period of time, the Khmer Rouge, if I recall my history, they were still present and active?
Very much, because the United States position was to have China dominate support of the resistance, and the Chinese did not give much support to the Royalists or the Republicans. They gave their main support to the Khmer Rouge, because they were their boys. They were wacko Maoists.
You know, this time that you start in Cambodia, Southeast Asia, during the Reagan Team B period, give me a short answer, because we're just about out of time for the program here. What is the gold nugget that comes out of this piece of your experience?
The issue that a nuclear war was averted because the Reagan team, not Team B, which was a part of the broader picture,
Right.
but the architects of the bigger picture understood the total economic communications tied into military, and also using your military to affect the other side's strength. So for instance, at that time the Russians were focused on the nuclear, so we did the quote Star Wars.
Okay.
The same way now, if we were doing a Reagan approach to the Chinese, it would still be space, because they're intending on neutralizing us electronically, space-based, and some other means by which we'll be neutralizing our strength.
Okay. We're going to be continuing this program. You're going to want to stay tuned for a part 2 coming up. We're talking about mediating in zones of terror with Mr. Al Santoli. And Al, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And audience, stay with us for part 2.
And there's another side to this also. So it's what people can see is the